Welcome back. This is Brighter Morning with Bo, and I am Bo Tiwari. And we're very glad that you stayed to look at this program and to listen to this program. We just spoke with Dr. Darren Conrad, economist at the University of the West Indies, and he made an assessment of the economic situation in Trinidad and Tobago. He talked about some of the things that we might do. He said that things are bad, but they are not. We are not so much on the brink of the precipice as we might think that there are things that we can do. And he made some recommendations, both of what the government can do now, and secondly, what the Prime Minister might suggest in his press conference as to how we are going to make our way forward. So we move on now to our next guest, and we are going to engage him on the Canadian elections. He's not ready, he's not on. Let's try and get him on, please. So we continue until we get our next guest online. And let's look at some of the things that Dr. Conrad said. He talked about an IDB report that talked about resilience and building resilience and capacity and public policy going forward. So that is one of the things that is available as a document looking at Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean that we might look at. And he talked about targeting GATE so that we can more align it with where the economy might be going. Okay? He talked about the sovereign wealth funds. That is basically the savings that we have in Trinidad and Tobago, and which the government has been dipping into. And he basically was talking about how we might deal with that going forward. Today we have the Prime Minister responding to the population and deriving his point of view from the cabinet retreat at the Prime Minister's residence in Tobago. So that would be an interesting press conference to look at and to see what he is going to say. We will hear from him whether it's going to be more of the same, whether we're going to hear anything that will make a difference in terms of the economy. And thirdly, whether we are going to hear anything new that might help us to think about new ways of going forward. So we wait to see that. Do we have him on the line? So we don't have Dr. Persaud yet, but last night, there was a debate among the leaders in Canada. I didn't get a chance to look at it because at the hour that I need to get up in the morning in order to come to this program ready for 6 a.m., I have to get early sleep. I have changed my whole sleeping pattern because of this program. So I didn't get to watch the debate. But maybe Professor Persaud looked at the program and we can ask him. Okay? Is he on?
Yeah, I am on.
How are you, Professor Persaud? How are you?
Good morning, dear Dr. Tiwari. How are you? I'm well, thanks. Good to see you. and thank you for having me on your program.
Yeah, let's take the volume up so we can hear him a little better. So I want to thank you for agreeing to be on the program. I know you have a rough schedule, very demanding schedule, and I'm glad that you took a little time to talk with us today. What I want to discuss with you are issues surrounding the calling of the elections by your Prime Minister, and your elections are on the 20th of September. What do you sense to be the mood of the society right now as you are in the midst of an election campaign? And how do you assess their appetite for the election? Because he called this election 2 years into his term, and that's very, very early. What is happening there?
Well, first of all, listen, thank you very much for having me on your program. Let me say that first, I think the mood in the country is not very positive for an election.
Yes.
There's a great concern about the Delta variant of the virus, COVID,
Yes.
how to control it at the provincial level and at the federal level. Some provinces have fairly stringent measures. For example, Quebec has a passport in effect now. Ontario has is moving in that direction. At the same time, people are concerned about an economic recovery, and I think there's a mood that the timing of the election is simply not propitious.
Yes.
So there is, and I think also there's a mood of a dissatisfaction with government, whichever government wins the election or comes to power on September 20th, whichever party forms the government. So there isn't much of an appetite for an election at this time, I don't think. I should also say that in legislative terms, I mean, the Canada Elections Act, Section 56(1) of that act, provides for an election every 4 years, of which the next election is due by October 2023. So as you pointed out, so correctly noted, the election is being called almost 2 years into his mandate.
Yes.
But I should say there as well that as you know so well, as a former parliamentarian and cabinet minister in the parliamentary system, that minority governments can pose challenges to the development and enactment of a legislative agenda by the governing party, because that party has to seek support. In our case, the NDP has played the role of the balance of power in the legislature. So a minority government can constrain a prime minister, and Mr. Trudeau, of course, would have felt that the timing when he did call the election was positive, and that he did have a lead in the polls, and he felt, a government holds an election when it thinks it can win, and he felt that he could secure a majority in the next election. So those are some of the issues.
He must have made a calculation that he could get a majority win in the election. Now that the election campaign is evolving, Do you think that he will get a majority, or he will end up with another minority government, or that the Conservatives can win on their own? Is that likely?
I think what do we turn to? We turn to the public opinion polls.
Yes.
And initially, the credible polls, the reputable polls, showed that the Liberals had a lead. But now that we are midstream into the campaign, the Conservatives now have taken the edge. I think the Conservatives are at 31 or 32, or anyway into the early 30s, and they're in front of the Liberals by 1 or 2 points. Mr. Trudeau has lost some points in the polls. So, is he likely to? Well, either he or Mr. O'Toole, the Conservatives, likely to form the government. Well, Mr. Trudeau, whether it's Mr. Trudeau or Mr. O'Toole, I think a minority government will take place, not a majority government, if the polls, remain fairly steady. Yeah.
So we may end up with a minority government anyway, but that would mean a Trudeau government, because the NDP, which is Canada's Socialist Party, is unlikely to support Mr. Have basically supported Prime Minister.
Sorry, you're being. I'm not hearing parts of what you're saying. You're just being
Sorry.
cut.
Let's try again. You are saying that we may end up with a minority government, but if that is the case, in Canada, that minority government is likely to be led by Mr. Trudeau again, because the NDP, which is Canada's Socialist Party, is likely to get a significant block of the vote, and they are unlikely to align with the Conservatives in an election. So we may end up with the same kind of thing, but maybe a different proportionate mix between the Liberals and the NDP. What do you think?
That may be, in the absence of any major shift from now to the elections.
Yes.
And if the polls remain where they are, we could very well end up with a minority Liberal government. And yes, the NDP is likely to support that government. But at the same time, listen, the Quebec and the Bloc Québécois, we'll see what the outcome is with the seats in Quebec, because Quebec nationalism under the CAQ, under Monsieur Legault, is I would say is at a remarkably high level at this juncture in the evolution of our constitutional democracy. So Quebec has 78 seats in the House of Commons. The NDP has, I think, 1 seat there. Let's see what happens. Monsieur Blanchet of the BQ may take some of the Liberal seats. We'll see what happens. But yes, at this point in time, again, in the absence of any other major considerations or anomalies, the Liberals may return with a minority government status and have the support of the NDP under Mr. Jagmeet Singh, and as you so rightly said, Canada's Social Democratic Party.
Yeah, can the nationalism in Quebec tilt the scale so significantly that it can cause an upset in the election? And if they make a deal with any party, who is it likely to be? Which one is it likely to be?
That's a good question. I am inclined to think that, well, first of all, if the BQ does secure the vast majority of seats, and let's not forget, in 1993, the BQ, the Bloc Québécois under Lucien Bouchard, received the majority of the Quebec seats and became Her Majesty's official loyal opposition.
Opposition, yes.
And so it can happen. Now, whether it'll happen under this particular leader, that's another question. But if it does, the BQ may support the Conservative Party.
Okay.
Some not too long ago, Monsieur Legault said that without giving the green light to any political party, did say that one of two things he would like from the federal government, and it seems to be more in alignment with the Conservatives, it would appear at any rate, is greater control over immigration and refugees and federal transfers for that. And the other is over Quebec, healthcare in Quebec, and whether it's to have more medical doctors, other healthcare professionals. Monsieur Legault would like as much autonomy from federal transfers to that. So, it could very well play out that if there is a major shift in with respect to the Quebec, the seats in from Quebec, that Monsieur Blanchet could align with the Conservatives rather than the Liberals.
Okay, so your assessment now is that really it's an uncertain election as far as outcome is concerned. I think that would be your summary position, right?
Yes. Listen, it's an election,
Yeah, you never know. Especially in a multi-party race in which all parties have some significant support.
Yeah, well, listen, the Liberals, as you know, has been the government. The PCs, the PC party, has a significant amount of seats. The BQ has some 32 or 34 seats. The NDP has some 24 seats. The Green Party has 2 seats. There was one shift by the third member. So you're right. We've got this sort of, you say a multi-party system, but the dominance has been with the Conservatives and Liberals. Yeah.
Yes, okay. So they are the dominant players, but I mean, there are others that can shift the balance of power. What are the key issues emerging in the election? I think I got from you that there's a kind of anti-government sentiment. I suspect this comes out of COVID and the COVID experience, and people are fed up about 2 things. One, a lot of federal or central government control. And the second thing really is the management of COVID itself and the challenge of lives and livelihoods and not being able to get it under control and let people live a reasonable or normal life. Am I correct in that, or would you like to guide me on this?
I think you make a good point. The management of COVID, for example, there is no federally regulated national passport, so to speak. The provinces are left to deal with the Delta variant and the COVID situation individually. Um, as I mentioned, Quebec now has a passport. Ontario
It's going in that
released a
direction. Yeah.
certification process that will unfold this month and next month. Alberta doesn't have these restrictions. Saskatchewan doesn't. So, yes, the management of COVID, there is some dissatisfaction, and probably the lack of a regulatory regime across the country, and I think that factors into this whole equation in the election. So I think I think your point is a telling one. Yes.
Are there economic issues that are dominant in the elections? And you mentioned, for instance, for the Parti Québécois, the concern about immigration was one particular issue. Is that a factor in the election?
Perhaps for the Quebec voters, but of course, we now have sorry, excuse me, a number of I think some 3,700 Afghans who have been uh, um, brought here because of the situation in Afghanistan, and that too will have to be processed in the country. So whether that, I don't, I'm inclined to think that the immigration factors will not weigh heavily in influencing the outcome.
All right, okay. What about the economic issues? What are the hard economic issues that are emerging, or the public policy issues?
There's been a good talk about affordable housing,
Yes, okay.
and for the NDP, for example, has talked about building affordable housing on government lands, national, state lands, federal government lands, and of course, COVID has had an impact on those living in apartments and mortgages and so on. So, affordable housing has been a much discussed or raised issue. Early childhood education and daycare, and the sort of rippling effects of that. The Liberals have proposed a $10 a day daycare, which means it'll be heavily subsidized, so that it has an effect on the female population. Women would now be able to pursue jobs and so on. So there is that, shared cost program. And of course, the conservatives have talked about this huge economic recovery plan. And of course, economic recovery entails, I mean, that's a huge undertaking, and it entails different components. I mean, to deal with. There's also, in addition to that, sorry, there is climate change issues, environmental issues. So yeah, the NDP has also talked about. Sorry, the Conservatives also talked about the number of jobs that they plan to help create.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. I noted in one report that I saw recently that there is a large number, a larger than usual number of female candidates and a larger than usual number of indigenous candidates. What is happening to the politics of Canada that is creating this kind of participation and the level of participation from these two groups, women and indigenous people?
Well, I think traditionally, politics have been, it's not inaccurate to say that it has been dominated by males. And there has been, women, visible minorities, the indigenous peoples have been moving, I think, into in the direction of having a say in what becomes public policy. So that, as governments develop and enact legislative agendas, they are more inclusive in the society and in the political process. As we talk, there are cabinet ministers in the country at the provincial level who are women, who are visible minorities, and probably the best known indigenous person who has served as a politician from Manitoba was Elijah Harper. And so I think, there is simply, a recognition and acknowledgement of those who have not been part of the political process and public policy making process in a multicultural society.
Yes, so there is greater inclusion now and greater participation. Do you think, for instance, the women's issues are everywhere in the world now. You can have an extreme situation as you have in Afghanistan where, women are just deprived of life and opportunity. Or you can have other situations in which women are simply asserting themselves more and demanding more and more opportunity, not just to serve, but to influence the political system, as I think is happening in Canada. But in Canada recently, you had this situation where, graves were found of indigenous children, usually in situations in which they were held in, not held, but they were looked after in terms of boarding type schools for them. And it was kind of a scandal. I know it was very traumatic for the Canadian population, and it raised really moral and ethical issues in this society. Do you think this kind of negative history is basically prompting more and more indigenous people to get involved in Canadian politics, and therefore room is being made for them? And secondly, the new Governor General of Canada is in fact now an indigenous person. So do you think that there is a kind of evolution of consciousness that is creating the conditions for this kind of politics and this kind of inclusion of indigenous people in Canada? What is happening?
Well, you say evolution of consciousness. That may be a nice way to put it. Listen, I think, and this is not confined to Canada. I think governments in constitutional democracies, in particular, the world over, are being called upon to be more responsible, more responsive, more accountable, more transparent, and more inclusive of those um, of those societies over which they have jurisdiction. And and in our case, with respect to the indigenous peoples, I think that is happening. And of course, the role of women's groups, movements, interest groups have been playing a role in all of this. The appointment of Mary Simon as our newest Governor General, I think, is indicative of this change, this consciousness and awareness that certain groups have not been part of the mainstream political process, and but at the same time they are part of the broader Canadian society. Mary Simon, the appointment of Mary Simon, I think has been a very positive one in that direction. She comes to the job with sorry, with experience as a diplomat and other posts, also from the Quebec area. Though she said that she was prevented from learning French, and the French component of her appointment may have been a bit of an issue for some Quebecers. But notwithstanding that, uh, the appointment of an Indigenous person as Governor General, I think, as you say, and a woman,
Yes.
another woman, though we have had other women as Governors General, Adrienne Clarkson, uh, and as an example, and the previous Governor General. So, and listen, at the provincial level, in Ontario, we had an Indigenous person as Lieutenant Governor, and the Lieutenant Governor is the Queen's representative in the province. The Governor General is the Queen's representative for the country, the whole country, and in each province there is a representative in the form of a Lieutenant Governor. We had an Indigenous person as Lieutenant Governor in Ontario. We also had an African Canadian as Lieutenant Governor, Lincoln Alexander, who was a cabinet minister under the short-lived conservative Joe Clark government
Yeah.
in 1979, and he was appointed Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. And in fact, on that very issue, given the residential schools uh, concern at this point, and public reaction, um, Ryerson University will be naming its, or has named its law school, the Lincoln Alexander School of Law, or the Lincoln Alexander Law School. And so that too is a positive move. But yes, the appointment of Mary Simon, I think, is a positive one in terms of the acknowledgement and recognition of this segment of the Canadian population. The Indigenous peoples, the First Nations peoples. So yes.
Okay. Now, I know your expertise is is constitutional law and the politics of constitution making and its impact on basically political systems and also on public policy issues. What are there challenging issues now in the constitutional order of Canada that are rearing their heads? And are there issues that are emerging that are likely to become potent as time passes?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest issue emerging as a constitutional matter is the introduction of a bill by the Quebec Premier, Monsieur Legault, to make Quebec the sole official French, the sole official language of Quebec, a unilingual language under the Constitution, and that's to be played out. That may very well end up before the Supreme Court. Quebec also has Bill 21 that prevents individuals from wearing religious garb or attire in public institutions in Quebec. That could also be challenged. But let's not forget that Quebec-Canada relations, Quebec and the rest of Canada, Quebec and ROC, rest of Canada relations, has been one of the axes around which Canadian government and politics have revolved historically. Yes. And so, as you and I talk, Quebec is the only province in the Federation that is not a signatory to the constitutional changes that took place in 1982, which saw Canadians achieve the entrenchment of a fundamental Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms, a domestic amending formula, a procedure to change the Constitution without having to resort to the British Parliament, and secured patriation, which means making the Canadian Constitution a Canadian document once and for all, because the BNA Act of 1867 was no more than an act of the British Parliament in 1867. So our Constitution, right up until 1982, was no more than an act of the British Parliament. Well, when those changes took place, 9 of the provinces finally agreed with the Prime Minister. There were compromises, but Quebec was not part of that deal. And so we had this constitutional amendment, the Constitution Act 1982, the Canada Act, without Quebec's assent. And so that has been a source of tension in the Federation. And this is a federal system, we must not forget, which means you really have 11 parliamentary democracies at work here. And Quebec has been a central part of the federal experiment. And so an issue, if an issue arises before the courts, and I think at this time, as I mentioned earlier, it's a remarkably high level of nationalism at this juncture, and it's under the strong and popular leadership of the CAQ leader, Monsieur Francois Legault, who has has indicated that he is not talking about separation, the separation of Quebec, but a lot more autonomy for Quebec. And historically, Quebec has argued for greater control over its social policy, greater autonomy for its policies generally, and historically had argued for a veto power over constitutional amendment. But of course, we have a domestic amendment formula now, and Quebec is all part of that. But the changes that took place in 1982 means that there has been an incomplete set of changes or incomplete constitutional renewal or revolution, if you will. That led to an attempted Meech Lake Constitutional Accord, ill-fated, in 1990, the Quebec round, so to speak, which would have recognized Quebec as a distinct society. Then the Charlottetown Constitutional Accord, which also failed. And then a referendum in Quebec in 1995 under Lucien Bouchard, which eventually led to under Jacques Parizeau at that time, which eventually saw the federal government ask the Supreme Court of Canada for advice on Quebec secession. And in a unanimous court said that Quebec cannot secede unilaterally under the Canadian Constitution from the Federation. So if there is an issue that'll go before the Supreme Court, it's likely to be something to do with Quebec's place in the Federation. And let's not forget as well, it was in Quebec that the PQ was born in 1976, the first legitimate political party having come to power under the leadership of René Lévesque, with a mandate to pursue Quebec's sovereignty or a sovereignty association. And there was a huge referendum in Quebec in 1980 on that. And then the BQ was a manifestation of Quebec, of course, and now the CAQ. So variants of Quebec nationalist parties, if you will, have been something of an anomaly in the federation, in the federal system.
Yeah, it's the pulling and tugging of the system. The concept long ago written about in Canada of two solitudes, the French and the English, has not really resolved. It has intensified, and it has taken constitutional form and created the conditions for political battles about autonomy versus federalism. Now, we have our own challenge here in Trinidad and Tobago. There is in the parliament, a bill for greater autonomy for Tobago, and there are battles within the Tobago population about what that autonomy really means and whether the bill grants that or not. So this is not too divorced from our situation, although I think in your framework, the battles are much more potent and much more intense. The battles continue here too, but we've been able to manage it. And I know that you have written a lot about constitutional issues related to Trinidad and Tobago, and maybe we can talk about those some other time. I want to thank you very much for being here, Radha, and thank you very much for taking your time to have a conversation. I think anybody listening or watching would have been enlightened on some of the challenges in the current environment and some of the issues that are very, very much alive in Canada. Canada is an important country to the people of Trinidad and Tobago because so many of our citizens have migrated there. Many of them are residents, many of them are citizens. And I know you yourself you were born here in Trinidad and Tobago, and your entire family is over there, and very much Canadians now. But it's great to talk with you and have that perspective, but also a sensitivity to what Trinidadians might be interested in. So thank you very much. We talk another time. Next time we talk about Trinidad and Tobago and maybe the Caribbean.
Sounds good, because there have been secessionist movements within the Caribbean
Yes,
as well.
of course.
It'll be
Nevis
interesting.
and St. Kitts Nevis, you have that. You have a couple of other places. It's been a source of tension. So we could talk about that and do it comparatively with Canada.
Sure, and of course, Trinidad and Tobago is based on the Westminster style system, as we have here in Canada. So there are a lot of similarities, but differences as well.
Yeah, we can learn from one another and the way we deal with it. So thank you very much, Radha, for being here. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening and watching. Thanks for staying with us. We've been talking to Professor Radhakrishnan Persaud. He's a person born in Trinidad and Tobago, but now fully Canadian. And he is a professor of political science and public policy law at York University in Canada. Thank you for listening and watching. This is Brighter Morning with Bo, and I am Bo Tiwari signing off and handing you over to Andrew Chan for the news.